Hi, welcome everyone. We've just been giving a little bit of time for everyone to join, just because some people might be running a few minutes late before they join. Just a few little Zoom housekeeping information things. So this is a webinar style, just like some of our others if you've attended. So unfortunately, we won't be able to see or hear you. And I can see a few people raising their hand, but I can't go on to you specifically. So if you have anything to say about the sort of Zoom functionality or what you can or can't see, etc., or if you can't hear us, do please pop it into the chat function. Secondly, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, you can ask them throughout using the Q&A function, which you'll find where you can type in your question. If they're to do with methodology or anything that I might be able to answer, I will try and do it as we go along. Otherwise, we are going to have a question and answer session at the end, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So yes, hopefully you've seen the message about our YouTube channel, where we will upload the recorded version of this webinar probably tomorrow. So if for any reason you have to pop out or your internet drops out or anything like that, then you can catch up with the rest of it later. So now I'm going to hand over to the brilliant Ben Averis. If Ben, you want to turn on your camera and unmute yourself? I think I've unmuted.
It should be turned on. Do I have to do something to turn it on? Because it's looking different, this system. Start video.
Yes, that's what you want to do. Yeah, it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's coming on now. Brilliant. Hi, Ben. You okay?
Hello. Hi there. So, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine. So I'm imagining everyone else can. They seem to be working. I'm just going to go along to that was obviously our sort of arrival screen. So I'll just go on to your first slide so you recognise where you're at. And for everyone watching, I'm sharing my screen so that Ben has the full capacity of the internet over there rather than trying to speak and share a screen at the same time. It makes for a smoother thing, but he will be having to ask me to go on to the next slide. So apologies for that. So Ben, whenever you're ready, you can ask me to go on to the next slide, and I'll simply turn my microphone and my camera off, so it'll be you on your own, if you know what I mean. But I am still there, so don't worry.
Sure. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I think it's a fairly, what do they call it, kind of narrow bandwidth internet connection here up in the Lowermuir Hills of southeast Scotland. And anyway, so hopefully all will go smoothly, technically speaking. So welcome to this introduction to the Broadleaved Woodland NPMS habitat. It's a kind of visual tour through it. I don't know if you've seen any of the documentation that's already available online, or maybe, I hope actually that at least some of you will not have seen it, because otherwise it might be a bit repetitive. And some of you might have been on the one we had last year, and but that was a long time ago. Okay, so it's a brief, as I say, a quick visual tour through a mix of photos, and I'll speak about them, photos and drawings as well, some of them showing habitats, the habitat level, and also species, some of the particularly characteristic species. So we can move on to the next slide, I think. Let's see how quickly it goes. Yep, that's good. And that's just an introductory picture of some woodland just down the road from here. Actually, I drew that last year. Actually, with that in mind, at the very broad level, with these sort of webinar things, last year I did at the very beginning of some of them, I wrote a little wee poem about the habitat, and so I'll recite it again. This is a poem about broadleaved woodland habitat. Okay. Broadleaved woods, the leaves are broad. Let's leave the leaves, I'm getting bored. Attention span, it ain't much good. Don't like being stood in broadleaved wood. Trunks and branches, textured bark, rough or smooth, light or dark. Different species, birch and oak, just the stuff for a boring bloke to look at on a lovely day when other folk are out at play. Trees grow tall, but trunks are grey. Leaves will fall the broadleaved way. Down and down, looking poor. Boring brown, green no more. Miserable poem. I just find when I write poems, I get miserable about them. Not thinking miserable, it's just fun. It's fun, it's humor. Okay, let's go on to the next one here, which is the beginnings of the actual stuff. So the broadleaved woodland habitat, in a way, it's quite simple because, as I've written there, it includes all kinds of deciduous woodland that we find in this country, including even young plantations, but not if they're kind of ornamental ones or commercial plantations, although sometimes it might be a bit tricky to decide if something's really obviously commercial or not, but more or less should usually be okay. And hedgerows, if they're native species in them, which I suppose most of them will be. 3 divisions within it. Each of those is pretty broad. Dry deciduous woodland, which is the biggest one. That's basically woodland as all kinds of woodland and scrub. It accounts for the greater extent of our woodland, deciduous woodland and scrub, because the other one, wet woodland, tends to be smaller certainly in total extent. The difference between the two is to do with the flora, really, a mix of wetland species, especially ground flora species, are characteristic of the wet woodland one to really help separate it. Partly the trees as well. You tend to get more in the way of willows and alder in the wet woodland, but you can get some of those here and there in the dry, and in the wet woodland you can get some species, very common, the tree species that are also found very commonly in the dry woodland category. So looking at the whole mix, tree canopy and ground flora, should help to separate that. And I'll be showing some pictures later on of characteristic wet woodland species. But if you don't get wetland species in there, by default, it's going to be the dry deciduous woodland. And then finally, hedgerows of native species, which is a bit of a more particular, narrowly focused habitat. So in this this session here, we'll go through first having a look at the dry deciduous woodland fine scale habitat, then the wet woodland, and then the hedgerows one. And beginning with the dry one on the next slide, there a very brief introduction to it. You know, it's such a broad type in itself, this dry deciduous woodland fine scale type. As I said, there are trees very varied, all kinds of broadleaf trees and shrubs, ground layer species, really, really variable. And so it's like, where do we start, where do we finish? It's good to have some structure to it, maybe. What I've done here is I've arranged them, going through them in relation to the acidity of the soil. So we can begin with a look at the dry deciduous woodland that's on more acid soils, then move on to the stuff that's on more or less neutral soils, and then finally the woodland that's on more base-rich or calcareous soils. And obviously these are subdivisions within the NPMS fine scale habitat. They're subdivisions that you don't need to, or not, certainly not expected to be recording in any kind of way. But the purpose of them here is that it helps us to understand the whole range of the dry deciduous woodland fine scale habitat type, and hopefully will make it kind of a bit more interesting than if I just described it as a whole mass of species that you could get, a whole load of trees and a whole load of ground flora species. Okay, so let's go on to the next picture here, which is starting to look at the acid end. The reason I've chosen the acid end is because in a way it's the more floristically simple, certainly for the vascular plants, the trees and shrubs and the ground layer species. There tends to be fewer. So it's on the whole, like if you did it by square meter or whatever. So here's some typical examples to look especially at the trees. The main trees in this dry deciduous woodland of the more acid type, birch and oak. They can be either kind of birch, sessile oak, either kind of birch, silver birch or downy birch, either kind of oak, the sessile oak or the pedunculate oak. And they overall about the most common there on the left is a whole load of birch in the West Highlands, and on the right is the silver birch. Downy birch is common in the more western areas, or common everywhere. Silver birch tends to have a bit of a more eastern and lowland distribution. So there's an eastern silver birch woodland on the right, both on acid soils. And you can see the heathery kind of ground layer underneath, lots of heather and blaeberry, or bilberry, either word, blaeberry, you call it in Scotland here. Very characteristic of those acid soils. And we can look at the next slide, which is the sort of counterpart with an oak-dominated canopy, one in Wales and one in the west of Scotland. Acid ground layer species again on the right. You can see a whole load of bilberry. I'll call it bilberry for the sake of geographical coverage generally. There's a load of polypody fern on that trunk of that oak on the left in Wales. It tends to be more common in wetter western parts as an epiphyte there. So yeah, oak or birch canopy, they obviously look very, very, very different from each other, but they can both be particularly common on acid soils, and you can get mixes of oak and birch as well. Next picture here is going to show some birch woodland, again in the Eastern Highlands, to show a bit of a more view of the ground vegetation. In the on the acid soils, the main ground layer vascular plant species tend to be either dwarf shrubs like heather, bilberry, sometimes bell heather if it's enough light, because it likes a bit of light, that species. Sometimes we can find some cowberry or crowberry, mainly in cooler, more northern parts. So here's a typical scene with a lot of heather and bilberry. We can also find the grass, Deschampsia flexuosa, the wavy hair grass, very, very, very common on these acid soils, especially where it's been a bit more grazed, because if it's not very grazed, it's a very common tendency for those dwarf shrubs to thrive and grow quite luxuriant like they are here, because they're very palatable species. Deer and sheep will eat them very happily. And we don't get a huge range of herbs, not very great abundance of sort of flowering herbs on these very acid soils, things like heathbed straw and tormentil and wood sorrel. They're quite pretty small ones, really, compared to what we see in the more base-rich woodland. Ferns can be pretty common in there, bracken and various sort of tufted ferns. So it's my wife Alison here, just fetching the landline phone, which I can't hear. At least he's dressed. You know, you hear these things on about Zoom things where some embarrassment happens. Anyway, where was I? Yep, ground flora species. So this is a place where it's no more than very lightly grazed, because those dwarf shrubs are so abundant, high cover and very, very luxuriant. The next page has got a bit of a closer look at these dwarf shrub species. You may well be familiar with them or most of them, but anyway, here's a closer look. Heather, the two commonest overall are going to be heather on the left there and bilberry, which is a couple of obviously very tiny leaves and very tiny flowers. That separates it from the bell heather, which has got bigger flowers, bigger, darker flowers and longer leaves, so in whorls of three. Bell heather does like some light, so if you find it in the woods, it's most likely to be on south-facing woodland where a bit of light comes through, or maybe by the edge of a bit of a glade somewhere. Bilberry is really quite shade tolerant, if anything more shade tolerant than heather. So in a lot of our acid woods, bilberry will be really common, and there might be little or no heather. It could be bilberry dominant. Cowberry on the right is a bit like bilberry, but evergreen with these sort of leathery, darker leaves with not so many teeth around the edges. And it's a more northern upland species, grows in cooler places. Quite common in some of the acid birch and pine, so woods in Scotland. Wavy hairgrass on the right, there's the a photo of the flower heads all nice and opened out. It's a beautiful airy looking grass. The little stalks within that inflorescence are really, really thin. They can actually be quite wavy. They look pretty straight on that photo because it's not really zoomed in that much. but they can have little tiny wavy things along them. I'm not sure if that's actually why it got the name wavy hairgrass, or if it's just the fact that the whole flower head can wave about in a bit of a breeze. It's a rather silvery pale sheen to those spikelets, which can catch the eye as well. When it first comes out, which it hasn't yet, not up here anyway, maybe it has down south starting to do. It's still pretty early though, really, for that species. When it starts to come out, those flower heads are very narrow. Everything's sort of compressed as it is with a lot of grasses, and then they widen later on. The leaves are very, very thin and wiry. They come in tufts. It can be quite dense tufts, so they can look very much like fescue leaves. Very, very similar to that. But they've got a bit of more of a ligule, up to about 3 millimeters long, something like that. Whereas the fescues, like red fescue, you might confuse it with similar looking leaves. But there's virtually no ligule in the red fescue. And anyway, the fescues aren't so common in woods. If you find a kind of very wiry leaf grass growing really abundantly on the ground in woodland, it's probably going to be that species, which is going to be on acid ground and probably quite grazed if there's an awful lot of it, because otherwise the dwarf shrubs would be likely to have been more dominant. So the next photo here, if we move on to the next one, it has a photo of, indeed, as I was just talking about, a dominance of wavy hairgrass on the ground in woodland that is reasonably grazed. That's actually not very far from here. Doesn't they have sheep in there very much at all, maybe, but deer get in, and they having a slurp of coffee. The effect of it doesn't take that many deer to knock the bilberry back, or any heather if there was, back to just quite short sprigs. There are scattered around in there. You can't see them in that photo, but, and of course the deer will eat the young regeneration of trees and shrubs, as will sheep and cattle. So that's an example of acid woodland. It's an oak wood, as you can tell by the texture of the bark on the trunks. And it's on the more grazed side, so it's not at all heathy. But so different facets, different appearances of heathy end of dry deciduous woodland: grassy, more grazed; heathy, less grazed. And if we go on to the next picture here, this is a rather particular facet, really, if you like, of the acid woodland, which is really, really mossy. In some places, mosses tend to be pretty common on the ground in lots of our woodland. The further west you go into wetter upland areas, the more of it you tend to see, because they do thrive pretty well in moist conditions. And these are some pictures here I've drawn of western acid woodland, dry deciduous woodland, which you can see it's quite heathy. The one on the left there, there's some heather and bilberry. The one on the right's a bit less heathy, but there's so much moss growing up the trees as well and on the rocks. It's a kind of rainforest, temperate rainforest. There's quite a bit of focus these days on the temperate rainforest in Britain and Ireland, and quite rightly so, because it's quite incredible stuff. On an international level, it's one of the things that is, you could say, pretty special really about Britain and Ireland. So that's temperate rainforest. It makes up a fair amount of the acidic dry deciduous woodland in the far western parts of Britain, like the West Highlands of Scotland and parts of Wales and the Lake District and west of Ireland. And actually some of our woodland that is not so acid, maybe on more neutral base-rich soils, and even some of the wet woodland as well, can also all be very, very mossy. So the temperate rainforest type stuff is not just the dry end of the dry deciduous woodland. So next slide here. I put a few questions in. These are the same ones we had last year. This isn't going to be like you've all got to answer the questions before we move on. It's just that apparently I was told last year you folks in the NPMS quite enjoy having some questions thrown at you. And so the first question, how to tell the Downy Birch and the Silver Birch, which we've only seen some kind of trunks and distant views of it, and I don't know how familiar you are with the difference between those species. So we will find out in a minute. And what kind of grass is particularly common in woodland on strongly acid soils? That's not very difficult, I think. And then if we have a minimally grazed birchwood on a shady north-facing slope in an upland area, what kind of vascular plant species might we expect to be very abundant there on the ground? So it's acid, it's shady, north-facing, and it's not very grazed. Okay, and the answer for that's a few pages ahead. If we go on to the next page, we can see what the difference is between the two kinds of birch, the downy birch and the silver birch. The leaves are one of the first things, well, actually one of the very first things that you can tell, that you can look at, is the trunk as you're approaching the tree before you get close enough to see details of the leaves. If you're looking at a birch trunk like that one on the right, with all that deep fissuring, vertical fissuring, and the kind of grey bark on the lower trunk, it's probably going to be a silver birch, Betula pendula. The young, mature one, the younger birches, all tend to have more of that kind of whitish, smooth, whitish bark with dark streaks, horizontal markings on it. But as the silver birch gets older, it gets more kind of uniformly grey and deeply fissured on its lower trunk. As the downy birch gets older, it just gets a bit more in the way of having more blackish patches here and there, but it tends to retain some of that pale whitish stuff. Even quite low down. Silver birch trunk tends to be a bit more sort of upright, the whole growth form of the tree, a bit more upright, graceful thing, whereas downy birch looks like it can't quite make its mind up, a bit more irregular branching, sometimes branching into sort of major branches from quite low down in some cases, whereas silver birch usually tends to have a single main trunk going a long way up. But then the leaves, the silver birch is double-toothed with a very sharp, drawn-out tip. So you see those double teeth on the edge. Every now and then there's a longer one sticks out, gives it a very jaggy-looking appearance. And the downy birch is kind of a bit of a more roundish, triangular shape, and the teeth don't vary so much in their length. And the end of it is more shortly pointed. It's not drawn out into that long fine point. So quite different look to the leaves. They're not always sort of textbook like that. Sometimes you get a bit of variation, and it can complicate things a little bit, but usually you can tell, and if it's in the winter, you can have a look on the ground and usually find some old birch leaves that have fallen down and still around. It's usually quite doable. Silver birch prefers drier ground. Downy birch can be on drier or wetter ground. It can take really quite wet places, and it gets into the wet woodland as well. Okay, next page, and we'll look at oak trees. Gives me time for another slurp of coffee. So, as I say, we better do oaks. I don't know. People got to think about oak trees. Quite rightly so. They're beautiful trees. Yeah. The sessile oak has a longer leaf stalk than the pedunculate oak, and the sessile oak has the leaf gradually widening from that base, compared with those lobes that sort of going backwards at first in the pedunculate oak. So a bit of a difference in the leaf shape. If you've got acorns as well, they're not on stalks in the sessile oak. That's what gives it its name, whereas they are stalks in the pedunculate oak. So it's very common though to find hybrids between the two. Yeah, so you can have a reasonable amount of stalk, as if it was sessile, but then you've got some kind of abrupt widening at the base. Really common thing. So if you find that in this intermediate, you can't make your mind up, it's probably a hybrid, and they're really common. And you can get sessile oak in upland and lowland areas. Same for the pedunculate oak. It used to be thought that sessile oak really was the main one in the hills and pedunculate in the lowlands. But they're a bit more mixed up than that. And the hybrid is so widespread, so common, that yeah, an awful lot of the oak we see in upland or lowland areas can be hybrid oak. It doesn't make any difference as far as categorization here is concerned, but it's handy maybe to know. So if we go on to the next picture here, start looking at some ground flora species. as I mentioned, but just back there, the answers, to the questions we had actually there on top of this page. Wavy hairgrass is the grass that is associated with very strongly acid soils in the dry woodland. And what we're likely to find on the ground in that minimally grazed, north-facing, quite shady upland acid wood is especially the bilberry, because it's pretty shade tolerant, it's palatable to animals, so if it's not very grazed, it's going to be like it as well. So it's just a place for it. But you could also get heather if you're in the north. As I said there, wavy hairgrass is probably going to be there. It's in most of our acid woodland, but even where it's absolutely dominated by heather and bilberry, you usually find at least some thin tufts of it hidden away there. So pictures on this page are of some little herbs, the little wee wood sorrel, tormentil, and heath bedstraw, some of the commonest herbs you get on the very acid soils in the woods and outside the woods too. Wood sorrel, very much like clover, but obviously the flowers there, it's dead easy. You never confuse it with clover. Leaflets are a bit clover-like, but they don't have the side veins numerous and parallel like they are in clovers. They're more curved and sparser, and not with all those teeth on the edge that you often get in clover leaves. You don't get clovers much in woods anyway, especially on acid soils. Tormentil's got leaflets with 3 leaflets, each one with some narrow shape and some big teeth towards the tip, and a couple of stipules. They're like miniature leaflets at the base, so it kind of looks as if they've got 5. Petals with 4 yellow petals. Sometimes you find a 5 petaled one, and it's very common on acid soils in all sorts of habitats, including woods. Heath bedstraw is one of our smaller bedstraws, very low creeping thing with leaves in whorls, little tiny leaves, 4, you can get as few as 4 in some of them, but up to about 8, especially on flowering stems, lots of tiny little white flowers. You get tiny little hairs along the edges of the leaves and they point forwards. That's handy to see, because it'll help to separate it from marsh bedstraw or fen bedstraw or limestone bedstraw, and you don't get the backward pointing hairs on the stems that you do on some of those other bedstraws. I must apologize if there's a problem with sound quality. There's probably nothing much I can do at my end. I hope enough of you can hear enough of what I'm saying, or if it's I'm positioning myself a bit closer to the microphone. I don't know if that makes any difference. It might be just a sort of bandwidth thing. As someone says, it's not too bad. Let's be optimistic. Maybe I should talk more slowly. I don't know if it's the way I'm talking. Anyway, shall we? Oh, someone says thank you. We can hear you okay. We can hear you, Ben. It's just a bit crackly, but it's fine. Some people have got crackly voices. But it's getting through. It's a bit like a thing I saw on television where somebody was speaking through a microphone, and then they came through and burst into the room and started talking, but they spoke with exactly the same crackly voice. That was their real voice. It was a comedy program. So yeah, bandwidth. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And nice big oak tree in the lowlands of Gloucestershire. Because here we're moving away from the more acid soils. See, we didn't take very long there because there's not very many species. Moving on to more neutral to mildly acid soils, you can say, this particular category. And we'll see a difference in the ground layer species, quite a big difference. Actually, in the trees, not quite so much of a difference, because oaks can feature big still here. In fact, moving from the acid soils to the more neutral soils, there's not much difference in tree canopy. Birch and oak can be very common in both. We do tend to pick up as we go onto the more neutral soils a bit more in the way of some things like hazel and aspen. Rowan could be a bit more common, although it's pretty common in a lot of acid places too. Not that much difference. It's the ground flora that really tells us we're in a bit of a different, on different soils. And the next few pictures here, we'll actually just going through thinking of some of the tree species. Beech is actually, it's worth mentioning here at this stage. I could have put it earlier on, but trying to keep things a bit simple earlier on. Beech can be very common on all of these soils, acid, neutral, and basic. Of course, it's native only in the far south, unless you're one of those people who's trying to push for the idea that beech should be regarded, treated like a native species up in the north here. But there's some beech in Scotland. A couple of them, one in the West Highlands on the right and one in the Central Belt on the left. A couple of drawings I did. Beautiful tree, even when it's in not native places. I do like it. So the further north you go, the more likely it is that you're going to find a rather more acid kind of ground flora. Somebody's saying if I turned off my video, it might. Should we try that? I'll stop the video. Okay, so okay, probably a good idea anyway. And so down in the far south, in places like the Cotswolds and the Chiltern Hills, that down there where beech is native, we can find beech growing. Oh, that's better. Good. Somebody said it's good to have this feedback, you know. So apologies, it was my fault, it's my video. It's yeah, you can find beech growing over a herb-rich layer on kind of limestones and chalk, and that's something that we rarely see in the north. But yeah, beech can be over all kinds of soils. Now, if we go on to the next picture, looking at a few of these tree species, hazel is more on the neutral to basic soils, and this is on the strongly acid soils. These are some hazels in the West Highlands in a very mossy place. And in some woods, hazel can be absolutely the dominant wood in the far west mainly. And these are some drawings I did for a botanical magazine in France. Actually, they had an article that a friend of mine had written about Atlantic hazelwoods, which are incredible places. That one on the left, that picture, see those orange splodges, which looks like a lichen. It's actually quite a rare fungus called Hypocreopsis rhododendri that likes to grow on hazels and a few other species in the far west. So they're great places, hazelwoods. Hazel can be really good for lichens and mosses. It's got quite a neutralish bark. There's some lobaria lichen growing on that stem of hazel on the far left, lower left of that picture. So hazel, important species. And somebody else reporting that improvements in the sound quality with the video off. That's good to hear. So if we go on to the next picture, another tree species that we find more on the neutralish soils is aspen. Quite an important thing, really. It's not that common, and there's been quite a lot of attention now in recent decades, for the last 10, 20 years, a good focus on aspen, sort of mapping exactly where it is. And its bark can be pretty good for epiphytes, and there's some insects associated with it as well, some quite rare ones. There's a thing called the aspen hoverfly. I've never seen it, but and what a beautiful tree, those leaves on those long stems. So that's sometimes you get little groves of aspen dominated woodland. Okay, next picture, and we can start looking at what's on the ground in these on the more neutral soils. So we're still in the same NPMS fine scale habitat, but that ground layer looks very different. It's a bit more coloured with those white flowers of the wood anemone, and there's violets there too, and the grasses. We tend to say goodbye to the wavy hairgrass, that very narrow, wiry-leaved one, and we say hello to broadleaf grasses, a bit more lush, which reflects the fact that these soils are a little bit more nutrient-rich, really, than the very, very nutrient-poor leached, often acid ones. So we get broader leaf grasses like Holker species. You can get the Yorkshire fog and the creeping soft grass, quite lush looking grasses. Agrostis, the common bent, and Anthoxanthum, the sweet vernal grass. So it's a bit of a more thick green looking grass sward in which we get a greater abundance compared with the acid places, greater abundance of herbs that can be a bit bigger, those sort of nice lush leaves of the wood anemone growing there. And let's go on to the next picture, a few pictures of some of these places. Bracken can still be very, very common, as in the acid ones, acid soils. So there's a canopy of mainly oak, and there's quite a lot of bracken. On that score, it could be acid, but that different color and texture of the grass shows that it's thicker leaf stuff, it's creeping soft grass, more neutral soil there. I drew a picture of it and I put bluebells in because it was just a bit dull on the picture. The photograph's okay, but I was disappointed with the drawing. We can take a bit of license here and there with the colored pencils, I think. On the next slide, we've got here some real bluebells, native bluebells. And these Western species in Europe, by the way, so we're quite lucky, quite fortunate in Britain. It's our kind of moist climate. Very good for the bluebell. On the continent, it doesn't go that far east. It gets in quite well into France and places, but yeah, it's an oceanic species, which we might take for granted in this country, but Britain is pretty important on a world scale for it. It does very well on these more or less neutral soils, about its best habitat really, especially in woods of oak and birch, and where there's a lot of bracken, it can be very common. We sometimes find, especially in lowland areas, we can find hybrid bluebell and Spanish bluebell, especially the hybrid, rather more common. And it does threaten the genetic purity of the native populations. It's a bigger, more robust kind of plant. It's got wider leaves that can be up to 3.5 centimeters wide compared with just 1.5 in the native bluebell. Its flowers tend to stick out all around the flower stalk, which is a bit more upright, whereas in the native one, they nod onto one side and the whole stalk can bend slightly across. The individual flowers in the native one, they're really quite tubular, parallel-sided, until you get right to the end, and then suddenly it turns around and petals come out and start to go backwards. Whereas in the hybrid and Spanish one, it expands outwards more gradually, kind of like a bell-shaped thing, more gradually to it. It's a wider kind of flower, and the little anthers inside there tend to be a bit more of a bluey color instead of more of a creamy white color that you get in the native one. So the can look rather different. It's a bit more kind of vigorous thing to be aware of. Really, it's a shame if it does affect all the some of the big populations of it. Mostly, we find that hybrid one in more lowland areas close to human habitation, maybe where it's been chucked out of someone's garden. You have to be quite careful though. We bought some, it was bulbs from a supposedly reputable supplier, and they were supposed to be specifically the native bluebell. We put them in our garden, and when they grew up and flowered, they were hybrids. So we've been having quite a job on our hands getting them out, because once they're in there, you've got to dig down deep and get those bulbs out. And it's not easy. That was a couple of years ago, and there's still some I had to take out this year. Anyway, okay. Let's rant about that. Over. Next picture, and this is not so colourful. It's some more or less neutral soils, dry deciduous woodland, in a place where it's really not very grazed at all, and it's not so colourful. But that doesn't matter. Colour isn't everything. Texture and form significant, as we see here with bramble. Funny, bramble is it's so prickly we might avoid it. But animals love it, so it's pretty palatable to deer and sheep and cattle. Take them away, and the bramble grows very, very well. And those tall tufted ferns. So those species there are a very good sign that it's not very grazed, and it looks so hugely different from the grassy and herb-rich scenes we've just seen back there. another kind of facet of dry deciduous woodland. Ferns, the ferns that grow in sort of tall tufts like these, Dryopteris species, male fern here, they tend to be palatable to animals. Bracken, not so. Cattle will trample through it and help to control it a bit. Otherwise, it'll just sort of get going unchecked, you know, even if you've got deer and sheep in there. So quite a big difference in palatability between bracken and those tufted ferns. So we can go to the next picture, and this is down south, where on these more or less neutral soils we can find wood spurge. We don't see it up here in the north. It's really a very southern species. One of the more distinct vascular plant species that can grow on the ground in these dry deciduous woods on more or less neutral soils. Here it is with oak in the Forest of Dean. Funny looking plant. It looks like miniature rhododendron at the bottom, and then this funny in the second year, this big extra lot of growth with those yellowy green flowers. Quite attractive. It looks like something's gone wrong with it somehow. It's something, maybe that's just from a northern perspective. It's a fine plant. On the next page, some more widespread familiar plants that can be very common on these sorts of soils in the dry deciduous woodland. Primrose and Violet. That's common dog violet. You can find there's another violet that looks very similar to that, by the way, which is the early dog violet, Viola reichenbachiana. I haven't seen it for donkey's years. It's down south on more base-rich soils, whereas the common dog violet will be on more or less neutral sort of soils. And how to tell the difference? You couldn't really tell the difference looking at that photograph, by the way, so I could have told you it was the early dog violet, probably, although there'll be some other little tiny differences. It's looking at the back of the flower. There's a kind of wee spur thing that sticks out the back, and someone's just written there saying they've got lots of early dog violet in Lincolnshire. Wow, that's a bit too far south to whiz down from here, especially as I'm supposed to be going out to Aberdeenshire pretty soon. But there is actually early dog violet does just about get into the extreme south of Scotland, which seems odd to find that species in Scotland. I've not been down there to see it. Anyway, it's that jutting out spur at the back of the flower is dark purplish in early dog violets and is pale in the pale, kind of even creamish in the common dog violets. Germander speedwell in the middle. Very, very, very common. You might confuse it with the wood speedwell, Veronica montana. One sure way to tell the difference between the two, if you look at the stem, you can't really see that detail in this photograph, but you can see how the stem looks a bit hairy down in the lower, just to the lower right of center, those pale hairs. Well, if you were to be able to look closer at it, not closer at the screen, but actually get the real thing closer, what you'd find is that in Germander speedwell, those hairs, it's like they've been combed or brushed to each of the two sides of the stem, whereas in the wood speedwell, they're sticking out evenly all around. It's like they started off as wood speedwell and then somebody came along and did this and they became Germander speedwells. Wood speedwell's leaves also are more stalked than the leaves of Germander speedwell, and they're a bit of a slightly brighter yellowy green color. Wood speedwell grows mostly on soils that are a bit more kind of slightly base rich and can be wetter as well. Germander speedwell likes it kind of neutral to slightly acid. Germander speedwell's overall the commoner of the species. So yeah, those two speedwells. Greater stitchwort, really, really common, pretty unmistakable. You might confuse it with lesser stitchwort, which has got much smaller leaves and much thinner petals, really quite different looking thing. So you might confuse it also with Melampyrum, the cowweed, which has also got leaves in opposite pairs and more or less the same kind of shape. But the stitchwort The leaves are kind of grayer. It's got a square section stem, and obviously the flowers are different. Common cowheat's got these yellow flowers that are more in the style of things in the pea family, and it grows on more acid soils. So there's some common, pretty familiar herbs. And on the next page, there's some more herbs, well, 2 herbs and 1 woodrush. And wood anemone, that's commonest in this middle neutral soils area of the dry deciduous woodland, and bugle too. Wood anemone leaves a bit like buttercups, but you find that you get 3 in a whirl coming off a flowering stem. It's quite a distinctive feature that. You can also get other ones just coming straight on the ground, from the ground, carpeting the ground. They're very, very deeply divided. The bugle has leaves that are kind of oval with obscure sort of teeth on them, and there's spikes of blue flowers, and it creeps around. You get these sort of long creeping shoots, hence the name reptans. Quite distinctive thing, especially when it's in flower. The leaves, yeah, they're quite sort of gradually tapering down towards their bases, and a slight sort of shine to them. They can have hairs on them, but there's a slight kind of sheen to the kind of sheenish texture to the upper surface. The one on the right, this is an unmistakable species, greater woodrush. Great big thick grassy looking, like a grass or a sedge, those leaves, but they're really kind of fibrous and bright green, and they have little white hairs, as do all woodrushes actually, have an untidy sort of scatter of longish white hairs along their edges. Not like proper hairs that are all coming out at regular intervals, that are like sort of properly attached. And they seem to be quite loose, and as if someone's just sort of maybe put a bit of adhesive on the leaf and then thrown some bits of little hair at it, and some of them stuck. That's how you can tell woodrushes from grasses and sedges. The greater woodrush is by far the biggest of the woodrushes. Great big thing with quite a good width, a centimetre or so of width to the leaf. The other woodrushes are much smaller. You can see the flowering head there with those lots of little tiny brown rush-like flowers in a branched head. It's very palatable to animals. So if there's not very much grazing, that species can become really dominant, absolutely, totally dominant, to the total exclusion in some places over a few square meters, total exclusion of other things. Usually there's other bits and pieces of something growing in it, but really common in woodland that's not so grazed, especially around the margins, in upland areas and upland margin areas, on soils that are particularly kind of neutral to acid, mainly. Okay, page of questions. And what's that plant on the right? Is it bugle, self-heal, or early purple orchid? There's 2 species we haven't actually seen yet. But it'd be a bit, and someone's put in an answer, yeah. And it'd be a bit, maybe a bit predictable if I gave questions only for things that we'd already looked at. How can you tell native bluebell from Spanish hybrid bluebell? Someone says self-heal. Yes, that's what it is. Yeah, it's got more purpley flowers. The leaves are more, well, they're in opposite pairs as they are in the other one, but they're not, they don't taper so gradually at the base. It's another difference. Square section stem too. Beautiful little plant. It's more of a grassland plant, self-heal. Native, how do you tell native bluebell from Spanish / hybrid bluebell? We looked at that earlier. And we'll see the answer to these again if you've forgotten on a subsequent page, the next page. But no, when the bottom question was just being silly, was what am I going to put in there? There's some pictures of some trees, some great big trees, and some of you might recognize them, maybe. One's in Perthshire and one's in Nottinghamshire. Which way round? That's not really a vital question for NPMS work. Okay, if we go to the next page, first thing is the answer, self-heal. Yeah, native bluebell, quick reminder, leaves up to 1.5 centimeters wide in the native, whereas up to 3.5 centimeters in the the other ones. So if you see really wide-leaved bluebell, be suspicious. Nodding spike, mainly sticking out one side of the stem in the native one. That's how you would like to see all our bluebells in the woods, really. Maybe I'm being a purist saying that, but stuff sticking out in all directions suggests the hybrid, and gradually widening out to that wider end with blue anthers as well. The colour of the anthers does really vary, though, in the hybrid. They can be getting kind of more of a creamy colour as well. So because it's a hybrid, you know, it can have varying characteristics. But generally, the wider leaves, widening out flower end, those are good features. But another thing, actually, the hybrid one has a little bit more of a tendency to go pink or even white, certainly pinkish colour. You will get native bluebells going those colours as well, but they're very much in minority. It's just a little bit more frequent to find the hybrid ones going those other colours. It's kind of be a sort of lead-in thing. Those trees, the big ones, the one on the left is the major oak. It's called in Sherwood Forest, quite a famous old oak tree. I'd like to see it. I've never been there. I drew that picture from a picture I found on a photo I found online. The one on the right, the Burnham sycamore and the Burnham oak, beautiful, great big trees, but dunkeld, huge things. Okay, let's go on, shall we, to have a look at the remaining dry deciduous woodland. It's taking a bit of time looking at dry deciduous woodland, but there's a lot to see in it. It's a hugely varied category. The more calcareous, base-rich sort of soils end of it. Now here, we do see a change in the tree canopy, bigger trees. We tend to lose the oak and the birch for the most part, and we gain ash and elm. Sycamore, if it's around, I know it's not native, but it can get particularly common on these sort of richer soils as well. Here's some with a lot of ash. This is in the West Highlands. That's why it's very mossy on those rocks and on the trees. But so change in the tree canopy, so you can often pick that out from a bit of a distance. You can be walking towards some woods and there's maybe some part of it's got a load of oak trees, and then there's an area that's got ash, different color, different texture, like paler twigs in the winter, that kind of thing. You can tell that from quite a distance. Kind of often you see that and you can think, maybe there's a bit of richer soil in there, maybe there's going to be a lot of ground flora species. So there's a good lead in there you can get from the trees. Then when you get in there, you find the ground vegetation is really different as well. There's as much of a difference between this and the other ones as there was between the neutral and the acid. So here in this photograph alone, we've got a whole load of dog's mercury in the front center there, big lush leaves, and some wild garlic. They illustrate the tendency here on these soils for herbs to do very well, ones that are bigger, lusher herbs. So we can go on from that to next picture, which is not showing great lushness of herbs. It's just looking from the outside. We've got a stand of hazel here. We had some hazel before on the more neutralish soils. This is limestone. That's limestone outcropping there. This is in Argyll. So hazel can be very common or locally dominant in the base-rich end of things, as far as dry deciduous woodland is concerned. It looks the same from the outside, but when you get in, it'll be different. Places like the Burren in Western Ireland have got a good lot of that. So if we now go on to the next picture, closer look at on the ground a whole load of dog's mercury. Quite an easy plant to tell. It's up now. It's an early thing coming up. Leaves quite ordinary oval, rather like the shape of some willow leaves, but they're in opposite pairs, and the shoots carpet the ground, and the flowers are kind of pale yellowy green color, like little catkins. And that's one of quite a big range of quite sizable herbs, quite lush looking herbs that really do very well on these kinds of soils. I've listed them there, things like wood avens, red campion, herb robert, wild garlic, hedge woundwort, sanicle, woodruff, wood speedwell. We've talked about some of these just back there, and the early dog violet, and some grasses. If we get grasses in these kinds of woods on these sorts of soils, they tend to be lusher, bigger grasses than the ones we saw on the more acid and neutral soils. So we can go on to the next page and start looking at some more of these lusher herbs. Woodruff on the left is one of our bigger bedstraws. We had some bedstraw on the more acid soils. It was just a wee little heath bedstraw, tissue little thing. Here on these richer soils, there's the great big Galea moderatum, the woodruff, beautiful plants. Unmistakable among our wood rushes, leaves very numerous in a whirl, lots of leaves, leaves in a whirl, and the flowers are quite distinctive, big sort of open heads of them. Sanicle has leaves like buttercup a little bit. They're rather shiny and hairless though, compared with most of our buttercup leaves, which are pretty hairy. And it's got that umbel, being an umbellifer, of little clusters of white flowers. And wood avens has sort of hairyish leaves that are divided up the lower leaves. They're kind of pinnately divided. You have little leaflets on the left and right sides, a few pairs of those, and then sort of bigger leaflets at the end, and then further up the stem they're just sort of quite deeply cut into teeth. And then the flower is like a buttercup flower a little bit, but the petals are smaller. It's quite a distinctive thing, quite easy to recognize. At its early stages of growth, though, you've got low rosettes even in the winter. You can see some of these, and you just get the sort of terminal lobe of the leaf without really much in the way of little side leaflets. So it can look a bit confusing. It can look almost like the leaves of Alliaria, the garlic mustard, which are different. They come up later in the year, and they have a sort of garlicky smell to them. Wild garlic on the right, yeah, is a closer view of that. Unmistakable, those hairless, big, lush leaves, and those masses of white flowers, which it'll be up and flowering, starting to flower around here. Probably for you folks down south, as some of you no doubt are, it'll be more well out. Beautiful thing, carpets the ground. It tastes like rather moister soils, so it straddles dry and wet woods. That one. Like soils neutral to base rich. Okay, next page. Some more of these big lush herbs. Red campion. Leaves in opposite pairs. They're pretty moderate size, hairy. Flowers unmistakable when you get them. It's quite a distinctive thing. The leaves are fairly sort of consistent in their shape and size as well, which helps. Wood sedge, it forms big tufts, and someone says wild garlic out in Northern Ireland. That's good. Yeah. Big tuft of kind of green to yellowy green leaves with moderate width. Particularly distinctive though in it is these other female spikes there, which hang down on a very sort of narrow, wiry stalk. It's a very graceful looking sedge. It likes woodland on more or less neutral to basic soils. And again, it straddles wet and dry, that one, like the wild garlic. Here's a close view of the wood speedwell that we spoke about, or that I spoke about early on. Hair sticking out all around the stem, instead of being brushed to two sides. A slightly brighter green leaf compared with the Germander speedwell as well. It's a lovely little plant. Herb Robert on the right, another easy one to tell. Leaves very deeply divided, vaguely a bit like some buttercup ones, but a bit more finely cut up than that, and with those unmistakable pink flowers. The leaves at this time of year when they come out, by the way, if you rub them, they've got a distinct smell. It's difficult to describe really. I don't know how I've never thought actually to describe what that smell is. But it's very distinctive. Tends to sort of die down, that smell, later in the year. At this time of year, they can also have quite a reddish tinge, those leaves, and the stems can be hairy and with a reddish tinge as well. Someone says a foxy smell. Yeah, foxy smell. I don't know, is the smell of a fox? Anyway, I'll show you my ignorance here. So should we go on to the next picture? And there's some grasses. I did say that the grasses we find on these soils are rather lusher than the ones we find on the more neutral to acid soils. And these show that. Here's wood melic on the left, quite a nice wide leaf, bright yellowy green, and the same can be said of the wood false brome on the right, which forms more of a tuft, whereas the wood melic tends to be either very small tufts or just sort of carpets of more sort of individual shoots coming out of the ground. And but in both species, the leaf can tend to sort of come up from the stem, droop, and then droop down at the end. Beautiful, graceful looking and rather bright yellowy green leaf. When they've got the flowers out, the wood melic is unmistakable. See those dark, quite big spikelets. It's a branched head. There's just a few branches and those big spikelets. The nothing else looks like that really. The wood false brome, I haven't got a picture of its flower head there, but it looks kind of vaguely, it's not branched. It's a bit like wheat and barley, in that you've got a number of spikelets all coming straight off the stem, and they've got quite long hairs, hairy things called awns on them, and the whole inflorescence can droop over to one side of it. Very distinctive grass, one of the commoner grasses in dry woodland on more or less basic soils. If you haven't got the flowers, you can tell the wood melic, by the way, from anything else, because I don't know if you know about ligules in grasses. At the very base of the leaf blade, which is stuff that sticks out, that most people would think, oh well, that's the leaf and the rest of it is a stalk. Of course, the rest of it isn't just a stalk, because you've got the sheathing part of the leaf that's wrapped very close around the stalk. And where at the top of the sheath, which is the bottom of the blade, in most grasses, you've got a little sticking out thing called a ligule, which comes out just on the same side of the leaf as where the blade goes off. In the case of the wood melic, it's like someone's put it on the wrong side. And there's a little very thin thing sticking up. It's very thin, but it's a few millimeters long. It's quite, you can see it easily. And it's on the opposite side to the where the leaf blade goes. Extraordinary feature. Okay, shall we go on to the next one, which is the end here of the dry deciduous woodland at last, you might be thinking. These are what they call negative indicators in the NPMS system, things that are worth noting because they could be a bit of a problem. They could indicate that something is perhaps not particularly good about the habitat there. Stinging nettle and goosegrass, easy things to tell. Goosegrass is a bedstraw and has tiny little flowers that are very, I wouldn't say they're very hard to see, but they're not noticeable like the flowers of the woodruff and the heath bedstraw. And it sticks to your clothes because it's got backward pointing hairs. That and the stinging nettle, which is pretty unmistakable in more ways than one. They are plants that do very well on ground that's got a high nutrient status, especially if there's been something like runoff coming in from agriculturally treated fields, or maybe where grazing animals have congregated, urine and dung and stuff. So that kind of effect on the environment can be detrimental to some of the more sensitive native plants that maybe can't outcompete the ones that do very well, like the nettle and the goosegrass. So eutrophication indicator. Ivy, if it's not very grazed, ivy can really smother the ground an awful lot, especially if there's been some disturbance at some point followed by a period of relative neglect. It's a little bit of a regional thing though, because the further southwest you go in Britain, there is a tendency for it to be a bit of a more natural thing for ivy to be very, very common in the woods without having to be associated with some history of human disturbance. And it can grow a lot up the trees as well, which is fine and quite a natural thing. Although if you've got special lichens and bryophytes on some of the mosses and liverworts on some of those trees, maybe it might swamp them out, but that's getting a bit peripheral. You don't want to be pulling a load of ivy off the trees, really, too much. Snowberry is down as a negative indicator. It's not native and it can spread a fair bit in the woods. Easy thing to identify, little oval leaves in opposite pairs and those white berries, which aren't a thing to eat, by the way. I'm sure you weren't thinking of eating them anyway. But in terms of badness in the wood, snowberry is nothing, in my view anyway, nothing as bad as rhododendron on the right, which I've got a photo there of it without its flowers, because you know what the flowers look like. They're big pinky things that some people like, which is why we got a problem with it, because they brought the things in here because they like the pink flowers, and now the stuff's got everywhere, especially in the west. And it gets into these woods, which are very special woods, those rainforest woods that I showed you a couple of pictures of early on. Amazingly special woods. And this thing gets in there because it thrives in that western moist oceanic climate. Difficult thing to get rid of. So yeah, big problem, rhododendron. Rightly so on the NPMS negative indicator list. Should we move on now to wet woodland here? Now, tree and shrub species, these not quite so varied as they are in the dry woods. Willows and alders and downy birch feature quite big here, but you can get ash and a few others as well. Ground layer, we get various, you usually got something in the ground layer that's indicative of wetness. So let's move on to the next page and have start going through these. Here is some downy birch. So as far as the tree canopy is concerned, that could just equally well have been a dry wood. But it obviously isn't, because the ground here, we've got a load of purple moorgrass, that tall tufted grass with its long flowering shoots, and bog myrtle, these are really wetland species. They like it acid and on the wet side. Bog myrtle is a little dwarf shrub that looks a bit like little kind of willows. It's got a resinous kind of smell to the leaves. It's kind of mainly northwestern in its distribution. So that's some wet acid woodland with a birch canopy. On the next picture, excuse me, we're looking at some purple moorgrass again. It looks very different to the one we just saw in the last photo. That's because it's a different time of year. It's in April, this time of year. That's last year's old growth that remains on the ground with a very pale buff colour to it. You can just see this year's growth coming out. This year being the year when I took the photograph, not this current year, although it will probably look like that at that location right now. So there's also some bog myrtle in that photograph as well, but without the leaves on, so you can just see it's sort of a bit of a purpley pinky haze going away there in the distance, where you've got that shrub growing, because the twigs tend to have that kind of reddish tinge to them. So this is wet woodland on rather acid soils. Beneath the oak, actually, there, oak and birch mixture with a bit of willow in the foreground. Okay, and the next picture, next slide, we've got some more willow, grey willow, very common species in a whole range of wet woodlands on various kinds of acidity status of soils. Here it's growing with soft rush, Juncus effusus, another very common plant that grows on wet soils ranging from mainly acid to neutral. So two very common species, just sort of common run-of-the-mill wet woodland, one might say, which indeed it is. It's quite nice. See the structure of those willows. They're very good for keeping moisture in, and because of the shelter, and that's good for a lot of mosses and liverworts and lichens to get going and be quite extensive. Lovely stuff. Next picture has got some more willows. On the left, we've got Phragmites, the common reed, unmistakable plants with those huge big leaves that taper out to quite some width halfway along the leaf. It looks a little bit like Phalaris, reed canary grass, by the way. You might mistake the two, except that Phragmites doesn't have a ligule, whereas Phalaris does. And it grows bigger, and it has a different flower head. It's got a great big kind of purpley brown coloured flower head with lots and lots of tiny spikelets in it, whereas the Phalaris is a bit of a more greener flower head and fewer spikelets, more bunched up. It's got a quite different, looks more like Dactylus, the cocksfoot grass, in its flower head. On the right, Equally unmistakable, the greater tussock sedge, Carex paniculata, growing among willows again, sort of grey willows here. It's almost like a bit like a sort of giant purple moorgrass, similar colour with that pale colour to the old dead material, and very tufted growth form, but so big, absolutely big. And you want to watch the edges of the leaves because they're pretty sharp. I cut my fingers on one once by accident. Those two species, the common reed and the Carex, the greater tussock sedge, grow best where the soil is more or less neutral. So on the next picture, we're very much into neutral soils. Wet woodland can be quite herb rich. Here it's got a load of iris, the yellow flag. It's not in flower, but you know what the flowers like, they're great big, huge, great big yellow things. But there are some yellow flowers a bit further back of some marsh hawksbeard in there. And there's also rushes and various grasses. It's just sort of a picture to show this beneath an older canopy here. The sort of general look of some of the wet woodland that can be various mixtures of herbs, grasses, sedges, and rushes. Very variable on the ground. Next picture's got another view of something broadly similar, not quite so colourful. Things aren't flowering quite so much, although they're very lush. Some will have flowered or will be due to flower, but that's in August. A lot of the things will have flowered and gone over. Somebody's saying there that older willow car, yeah, that's exactly the place for greater tussock sedge. I can see that little thing just written up there. So yeah, it very much, those sort of older willow places suit it really well. Here we got the leaves of marsh thistle in the foreground. You can see that, and the soft rush, the marsh hawksbeard, real tangle. It's not very heavily grazed, and beneath alder as well. Next page has got some more alders on flatter ground, and the ground vegetation here is absolutely dominated by big tussocks of this grass. You can't actually see that they're tusky. There's so much of it, it all coalesces. This is some tufted hairgrass, Deschampsia cespitosa. Leaves are quite tough in their texture. And very rough on their upper surface. Actually, they've got tiny little teeth that point backwards. So if you feel it pointing, if you move your hand in a forwards direction, it feels really, really rough. Don't put it in your mouth, by the way. I did that once, and it started going backwards down my mouth, and it wouldn't come up back again. Not without a lot of coughing and stuttering. That was a long time ago. I learnt my lesson. The flower head is very, very branched, a bit like a bent grass, the agrostis, but much, much bigger, with lots of very small spikelets. It's an unmistakable species of grass. It's related to the wavy hair grass that we saw on the acid soils, which has wiry leaves, completely different looking plants. Because this has got leaves that aren't wiry. They've got a few millimeters thickness, and they're long and they're parallel sided and very rough and quite dark. Then they go paler and they die off. And usually you can still see some of the old paler leaves and some of the younger, darker leaves at the same time. So you get a sort of salt and pepper effect quite often. So unmistakable grass of mainly damper, more or less neutral soils. So another picture coming up here. This is, again, fairly neutral soils, wet woodland. Here, the soils are very nutrient rich, nitrogen rich. In this particular case, I think that's because the stream, the river nearby, that's just a sort of braided bit of that river. There's a bit more of it further left. When in spate, it dumps a silty soil from further up, that's come further upstream, and which is quite nutrient rich. So you get a lot of plant species that do very well where the soil is quite nutrient rich. Butterbur is very prominent there, the big, big leaves of it. Those leaves will grow even bigger through the summer, and like a forest of these things. And nettle and goosegrass, like we had on the negative indicator list for the dry woods, they do very well in this place here, where it's very nutrient enriched, and there's some sweet cicely too. Comfreys can grow well in these places, and everything gets very, very lush in the summer. all kind of whizzes up because soil is so rich. And in the winter, funnily enough, it can die right back to almost nothing, because all this growth that came up in the summer tends to have enough of a softness of texture for it to die back really quite a lot in the winter, more so than the dying back of ground flora species on more neutral to acid soils, where there's less difference through the year. So it can be like, they can look like different places where it's very nutrient rich. And the next picture's got another example of something, it's in that same category as far as nutrient enrichment is concerned. This is actually beneath a stand of planted poplars, non-native balsam poplars. They're lovely trees, actually. They're not native, they're beautiful trees though. And when the leaves come out in the spring, they got this most fantastic smell. I think so anyway, some people might not, but here, see all those nettles, masses of nettle and goosegrass coming up with it as well. There's also wild garlic doing pretty well too. It's, oh, somebody says here, Himalayan, I say somebody, it's Christopher Perry, I should say your names. Everybody's got a name, haven't they? Thank you, Christopher. Himalayan balsam, very common. Yeah, in these places by rivers and where it's reasonably nutrient rich. Fortunately, in the places I've been exploring and taking these photographs, there hasn't been so much of it, but yeah, occasionally we do, especially maybe in the lowland areas nearer to human habitation, that can be a big feature in these same sorts of environments. That's we can, if we go on to the next picture, we can see some closer views of ground flora species in the wet woodlands. Here's some with yellow flowers. Marsh Marigold, which is a kind of buttercup, more or less in terms of related species. Flowers like a big buttercup, but the leaves are quite different. They're very, very heart-shaped with little teeth, crenulated sort of teeth. They're not sharp teeth around the edges. Quite big leaves, with quite firm texture to them. Flowers quite early, likes wet, neutral places. Marsh hawksbeard likes the same sort of places, but its leaves are very different. They're like dandelion leaves a bit. They've got slightly backward pointing teeth, but you wouldn't confuse it with dandelion because it's a more pointed, gradually pointed leaf, and it's got leaves up the stems, which dandelion doesn't have. The stems are branched. Dandelion just has a single stem with one flower at the top. So even though they're both composites, they're kind of related that way. You would never mistake them for each other. Marsh hawksbeard, so that because that is that leaf shape with the backward pointing teeth, it's dead easy to identify. Yellow pimpernel, it's a creeping little thing with leaves in opposite pairs, just a sort of fairly ordinary oval leaf. More than anything else, it probably looks like Stellaria media, the chickweed, except which grows in different habitats, by the way. It's more of like disturbed places and not quite so much in the woods. Chickweed has got a single line of hairs along one side of the stem. Yellow pimpernel doesn't have hairs, and when the flowers are out, obviously they're distinct. There's another one called down south called Creeping Jenny, Lysimachia numularia. Grows in rather similar places. Its leaves are broader and more heart-shaped. Marsh Pennywort on the right, you never mistake that for anything really, except maybe wall pennywort or navelwort is another name, which doesn't grow in marshy places like the marsh. The marsh pennywort grows on wet ground, wet squelchy places in sort of fens and marshes and wet woods. Wall pennywort grows on rocks and walls and sometimes on the bases of trees. Having said that, I once found marsh pennywort growing on rocks. That was in the far West Highlands, in a place where there was so much rainfall that even on a relatively well-drained kind of substrate as that, such a wet, well-drained habitat, it was wet enough for the marsh pennywort to grow. That's not going to happen very often, finding things like that. So basically, if it's growing on the ground and it looks like that, it's going to be marsh pennywort. And it's got more flowers are really quite inconspicuous. Next page has got some more herbs of these wet places. Purple loosestrife with leaves, narrow oval kind of leaves, in opposite pairs and a great big spike of purpley flowers. Tend to find it a bit more in the open on the whole than in the woods, but it can get under some trees. Wood clubrush looks a little bit like that greater woodrush, but you don't get the whitish hairs along the edges of the leaves, for one thing. And it grows in wetter places, in the open or in the woods. And marsh bedstraw looks a bit like the heath bedstraw, but leaves, you don't get quite so many leaves in a whirl, only 4 to 6 compared with 4 to 8. It kind of scrambles up a bit taller amongst bigger plants, and it's got a rougher texture because you've got backward pointing little prickly hairs along the leaves. And another species that can look rather similar is fen bedstraw, by the way, which has rather more leaves in a whirl, and the leaves end in sharper points. And it's very, very rough texture because it's got even more of these prickly hairs on the leaves and the stems, down backward pointing ones that really sort of catch your fingers, almost like goosegrass. And that grows in similar places to marsh bedstraw. So in contrast, the heath bedstraw feels really smooth because if it has any hairs, they're on the leaves and they're pointing forwards. Meadow sweets, beautiful flowers, that creamy colour to them, and they've got a nice sort of airy scent, which is quite different from the sort of medicinal, like, what's that stuff, TCP kind of smell that you would get if you were to crush the leaf stem or the stem of the plant as a whole. The stems, the main stems and the leaf stalks are rather reddish in colour, and you can see the leaves in that photo there. It just about shows them that they're a bit like you have on an ash tree. You've got a leaf stalk with opposite pairs of little leaflets, and the little leaflets are very toothed. Little leaflets occurring in pinnate fashion in opposite pairs along a rather reddish stalk will suggest this species, but even more so, you will find the thing that makes it unmistakable is that in between some of those pairs of leaflets, you've got like tiny, minute things that are as if they're kind of trying to be leaflets, but they haven't quite made it. Really, absolutely minute, and they're a bit more rounded. Some of them, extraordinary feature, and they're very green, and they stand out visually from the red stem. So it's an easy thing to tell. Very palatable to animals as well. That meadow sweet. So whatever that medicinal smell is, it doesn't put them off. On the next page, we got another lot of herbs. Again, some of them getting quite tall, like meadowsweet and marsh thistle. Looks a rather different thing to the common weedy thistles that we get on waste ground, like the creeping thistle and the spear thistle, because it's got that darker purplish tinge, and its flowers are a bit darker. And that darker tinge is because the around the edges of the leaves, where you get spines, of course, being a thistle, they tend to be rather purple. It's like someone's got a kind of dull green leaf, and then they've taken some special pen and gone dark purple all very carefully all around the edge. So it's an easy one to tell that. Water avens is a bit like wood avens that we saw earlier on. Wood avens grows on the dry ground, water avens on damper ground. They both like soils that are sort of neutral to rather base rich. Water avens flowers, they kind of droop down. They're this dull pinky sort of color. So color, it's funny that those plants, it's hard to imagine anybody disagreeing with you if you said, what beautiful plants, what beautiful flowers, the way they hang down like that. And what a nice color, subtle sort of color. But if you took that color in some other context, people might say, oh, that's too wishy-washy and dull. I don't like that. I want something better. I don't know, if you had a car that color or something, maybe. Anyway, its leaves are a bit like the wood avens leaves, but you get more of a sort of light dark effect on the surface, with the side veins cut down into little kind of like equivalents of valleys, little bit more sort of textured, and the end leaflets can be a bit bigger and more abruptly tapering at its base. You do get hybrids between the two, by the way, between water avens and wood avens, and they have a sort of flower that's in between those two, if you can imagine that. Maybe you have to see it to imagine that, because it's hard. One's drooping and pink and the other one's upright and yellow. Yellow flag, the iris, we saw a picture with its leaves before, and here are the flowers. easy thing to tell, even with those leaves. And one feature of them is that that the whole spike, the whole tuft of those leaves is like it's flattened laterally, squashed from one side to the other, and they're completely hairless. And there's another picture of purple moorgrass on the right, showing its very tussocky growth form. And you can't really see the flowering heads so well on there, but they come on long stems, and the flowering head is branched, but it doesn't branch very, very widely and openly, and so it looks quite narrow. And the leaves, those are this year's leaves, but they go very pale and buff, and they break off as well, and form in the winter and form a sort of mat of pale stuff around the base of the tussocks. Because the base of the leaf blade, it narrows down at the base, and doesn't have a ligule either, and it's that's its sort of weakest point there. Okay, should we go on to the next picture here, which are the negative indicators in wet woodland? This shouldn't take quite so long, because the stinging nettle and the goosegrass, they're there for the same reasons as they were in the drier woodland, to do with eutrophication. Himalayan balsam, yep, quite rightly here, because it just takes over, hard thing to get rid of. Western skunk cabbage, we won't see that quite so often, and you might think, wow, that's such a great plant, what's the problem with that? But yeah, it can spread around and be a problem. It's very big. At first glance, you don't appreciate the size maybe when you see that picture, but look at those nettle leaves right by it. It's compared with the lords and ladies, the Arum maculatum that you can find is native to this country, and is not that yellow colour, of course, but it has the same kind of growth form. This thing's quite a monster. Giant hogweed. Again, that photo doesn't really perhaps show its scale so well, but if you had a person standing next to that, obviously depending on how tall that person was, but a reasonably tall person would be the same height as that plant. It's a big thing, huge leaves, huge thick stem, and it can spread around, especially along rivers, and it's bad news if you go touching it, especially when the sunlight shines on your skin after you've touched it. Nasty rashes and things. So those are the negative indicators for wet woodland. And was on the next picture, because I don't want to be taking too long with this. I hope I'm not dragging too much. Some questions about the wet woodland plants. Marsh Marigold, we had its picture in flower and its nice heart-shaped leaves. What might you confuse it with if you didn't have the flowers? Something about those leaves, something that's very common and you can also find in the woods. How do you tell the marsh bed straw from the heath bed straw? Another thing to think about. Is that leaf on the right valerian, common valerian or marsh valerian, or water ravens or meadow sweet? And of all the wet woodland scenes that we've looked at the more habitat kind of level, which do you think would show the greatest difference between summer and winter in terms of how much vascular plant growth you're looking at? Okay, obviously I'm not waiting for answers to those before moving on. So otherwise we might be here for too long, especially with 100 and something people participating. If you imagine if you waited for everybody to give an answer, and that would be unfair as well. Answers. Lesser celandine has leaves that look a bit like marsh marigold because they're heart-shaped and hairless, but they're much smaller. And they don't have the regular crenulation types of teeth, and the flowers are very different with those narrow petals. It's also related to buttercups. And it's not quite such a sort of wetland species. It can go in dampish places, but yeah, very common woodland plant coming up in the spring. Marsh bedstraw versus the heath bedstraw, rougher stems and leaves, the fieldsman, because of those backward pointing prickly hairs. Moving on a bit quicker, meadow sweet was that what that plant was, as I'm sure you recognized. And among the habitat photos, the biggest difference between summer and winter, it was those last two that were on the nutrient-enriched ground, where everything shoots up big in the summer, dies back to very little in the winter. Okay, should we whiz on now to what you call hedgerow, where you get shrub species. And some of the commonest native shrub species we can find, and you're probably familiar with all of these, hawthorn, blackthorn, and elder there. showing their flowers and their fruits. Distinctive shapes of the hawthorn leaves, the more ordinary shape of the blackthorn leaves, but it's distinct with its thorns and its flowers and its fruits with their incredible taste. And the elder leaves, a bit like ash, but fewer leaflets, and it's got a distinctive rough bark and a thick brownish stem. It's all quite different to, you wouldn't really mistake elder for anything apart from red-berried elder that has red berries instead of dark ones and has flowers that are in a more pointed sort of raceme as opposed to a flat-topped umbel, and a few other differences as well. But, okay, next picture, some more shrub things at the top. Gorsum Broom, they can be very common in hedges. Prickly gorse, non-prickly broom with its leaves with 3 leaflets, and holly, prickly, easy to identify. They can be common in the hedges, in all native species. The ground thing along hedgerows is very variable because it's got an element of woodland with the shrubby element to it, or tree species in it, and indeed a few trees can be growing in the hedgerows. So enough shade to have a bit of a woodland element, as we see there. Ferns, dog's mercury, you know, but also a bit more light coming in. And so it's Adam heading off. I know you, Adam. Hello and goodbye. Yep. And garlic, what do you call garlic mustard, Alliaria. That's very much a woodland margin plant, so it does very well along hedgerows. It likes that sort of intermediate light condition situation. And next picture, there's there's Adam again. It's good to meet folks, you know. Yeah. Hey, okay, these are things that kind of scramble up and around the more woody, the sort of tree shrub species. Honeysuckle can be very common in hedges, and ivy, of course, we had in the woods. And there's the hedge bindweed, Calistegia, with its great big flowers and its heart-shaped leaves. And so hedgerows can be a good place for that because they're very dense. A lot of stuff for these things to get a hold of and get going. I think if they need something for to hold on to, if they can't do it on their own very easily. Next page. We've got bramble and roses, which can be very common again in hedges, both with the prickly stems. And I made a comment there because bramble is listed as a negative indicator in the hedgerows, and asking what did it do wrong. Of course, it does a lot of things right when it provides us with those nice fruits. So there are various species of rose. One can get into tricky ground with some of those identifications. Oh, and even more so with the brambles, because there's all those kind of micro species. So let's move on to the next picture. Some more of these scrambling things. If you're down south, clematis, wild clematis on more base-rich soils, but hedgerows is important habitat for that. And the white bryony on the right, or the black bryony. I've just put a drawing of this leaf because I haven't got a photo of it. There's further south in Britain, there's definitely a bigger range of species, scrambling species that you get in the hedgerows, and some of the shrubs as well. So on the next page, we got some of that. At the very right there, we've got spindle and dogwood, both with leaves in opposite pairs, and the dogwood's particularly distinctive with the way those leaves, the way the veins, the side veins, they try to get to the edge, but they never make it, they curl around. And quite a broad leaf. Spindle's a narrow leaf, but those fruits are unmistakable. To southern, more southern native species doing very well in hedgerows. And those herbs that are listed there as NPMS positive indicators. So far, actually, I've been racing away through this thing, by the way, and I haven't mentioned anything about positive and negative indicators, except, well, the negative ones I have, but the positive ones, because there are lots of them. They're generally things that are okay, pretty good things to find, and it's not problematic in terms of the quality of the habitat. Though they're not the ones on the NPMS positive indicator list aren't the only species that are goodies really to find. If you put them all down, there'd be a list of positive indicators that was too unwieldy. Anyway, for the hedgerows, yeah, there's Hart's tongue fern, which also grows well into the woods, as does the lords and ladies, and the enchanter's nightshade and the foxglove. They can be all well within woods as well. And they're pretty unmistakable. The Hart's tongue fern, the only fern with big fern, anyway, with those leaves that are not divided up like that. It's very leathery. The lords and ladies looks just like that, with those big leaves with the sort of backward pointing lobes at the base. And of course the poisonous red berries later on. Enchanter's nightshade, leaves are in opposite pairs, and they look a bit like some poplar leaves, but you would never mistake it, because poplar is a tree. Even the poplar sucker has got woody stems. And the foxglove, big rosettes of those big hairy leaves. It likes the more acid grounds and can do particularly well where there's been a bit of ground disturbance. Okay, the next page. Umbellifers do really well in hedgerows. These big white-flowered umbellifers, cow parsley, hedge parsley, and so on, rough chervil, hogweed, for some reason, the cow parsley is not, it doesn't make it to the list of NPMS. So, well, it does make it to the list of negative indicators. And I think that's because, even though I've not really seen it being a problem, certainly in parts of Britain I've been working in, I think it maybe has been found to be thickening up an awful lot in some places, probably down south, perhaps at the expense of some other species. Anyway, they've all got these leaves a bit like kind of ferns, the way fern leaves are divided up. But obviously they're not ferns, not with those flowers, and there are other structural differences too. And the hogweed's the biggest and the coarsest of them, with leaves divided up into just sort of quite big, broad segments and a very rough texture. The other ones are more finely divided up, but the rough chervil has got purple spotted stems, and the segments of the leaves end with quite a blunt tip. And hedge parsley is kind of more pointed, and cow parsley, which it's a picture of on the next page. I wasn't going to have no picture of it. So if we go on to the next page, we'll see a picture of cow parsley on the left, which is very, very common. The little segments of the leaves are fairly pointed on that one as well, but it's a bigger plant than hedge parsley. And this is the last slide. So these are the other negative. Sorry, not the other negatives. These are other species that we can find in the hedgerow sort of habitat here, and the other negatives, I've mentioned them in the text at the top. That's goosegrass, nettle, and Himalayan balsam. So there's no point really in illustrating those again here. It would take up more space and everything and more time. And then those other ones below, the things that we can find in the hedgerows, the burdock with its great big leaves, big heart-shaped leaves, and thick stems, and those fruit things that can come up on your clothes. Ground ivy has kind of roundish leaves with crenulate teeth around their edges, and those purple flowers. It's mainly a woodland plant. Barren strawberry grows in a huge range of habitats and has trefoil leaves like wild strawberry, but they're duller colour and they've got hairs that stick out underneath, whereas on the wild strawberry, that's the one that produces the fruits, the hairs don't stick out. There's the lesser stitchwort that I mentioned earlier on. See how different it looks to the greater stitchwort, with tinier leaves and thinner petals. And Solidago virgoria, goldenrod, is a thing that you can find with a cluster of yellow flowers and fairly ordinary looking oval leaves, and quite a tough textured stem. It grows especially in rather rocky places, actually, that species. So those are all positive, listed on among the various positive indicators, by the way, for the hedgerow habitat. Those last, not the cow parsley, but the other ones. Okay, so that's the end of the whole sequence, and I should say back to Sarah. I hope it's been of interest anyway, and I hope I haven't been rambling on too much. And okay, thank you for listening. Over to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And I know talking for a good hour and a half is pretty exhausting, so thank you for going through all of that again. I'm sure it's been very useful for everyone. And I think turning your video off seemed to make a massive difference to the bandwidth problem. So that's really good. I'm just going to go through some of the questions while they've come in. So one of the first ones that we had earlier on, Ben, that you might be able to help me with was around where this person lives, Allium paradoxum, so few flowered leek, seems to be taking over along the river in the woodlands where wild garlic used to be common, and in her garden too. Is this a problem elsewhere, and should she be worried?
I think it is actually a potential problem, but I think it's from what I've seen, likely to be restricted very much to certain sort of places, like along the edges of rivers. I've not seen it taking over so extensively as to really get into the, how wild garlic can be really extensive and go right up slopes and everything. So I don't really see it as being that much of a problem, though I agree. I think it can actually has the capability on places like some riverside banks to take over, because it can be quite vigorous.
And here we've just got somebody saying that down in Sussex, cow parsley is being replaced by a plant which she thinks may be called Alexander's. And is this good or bad? And I have to actually agree, because I was only in Sussex at the weekend, because it's where I'm from. And as we were driving around, I did notice an awful lot of Alexanders along the roadside verges. So, but I'm not sure as to whether this is necessarily becoming a problem or whether it's related to climate change. I guess that's why we do the NPMS, to find out these answers. But anything you know about at all, Ben?
And we've got a comment come up there. So much Alexander's on verges in Essex too. See, I was right to be friends with cow parsley on a couple of pages back, and to suggest that it'd been unfair to put it on the negative indicator if the poor thing's actually suffering at the hands of Alexander's. I don't actually know about that, because Alexander's is more of a southern thing. We see it. I've not seen it enough to really know about its ecology in that way. It could be out competing.
I thought it was quite a coastal species often as well.
I have seen it inland.
Here, yeah.
I've seen it inland down south on visits down south along roadside verges. So it's and it is big. It's a big, vigorous thing. So I'm not surprised. It's a huge problem in Kent.
We've also got a question here about how far south do you have to be for beech to be considered native? So they live in South Wales.
Yeah, South Wales, yes, and Gloucestershire, and across to the Chiltern Hills. I think it's really a long way south. It's just really down there. I think by the time you got up into sort of the Midlands, the problem, I don't know where exactly the line will go, but I think it really is way down south, down there a long way, just the southernmost part of Wales and across to like the Cotswolds and the Chilterns, that kind of latitude, as far as I understand.
Okay, brilliant. A lot of people, by the way, have been saying throughout that they love your drawings, Ben, so I think that really adds to it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And a lot of great feedback about the presentation. So you've done another really great one, Ben. So I think that's probably all the questions that have come through that I can see. Obviously, if you've got any more that you suddenly think of later, you could perhaps post them underneath the recording of the webinar on the YouTube channel as a comment, and then somebody could answer you that way. Or you can always contact us with the email at support@npms.org.uk. So as I've mentioned several times, so this is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel under the playlist webinar recordings, and hopefully I'll get that up tomorrow, and you can rewatch it at any time you want as well. So thanks again, Ben, for all of your hard work, and I hope everyone has a really great lunchtime, and we'll see you at the next Habitat webinar. So thank you for coming today, Ben, and thank you to everyone for listening. Okay.
Thank you everybody. Okay, bye-bye.